PIRL Institute 2020, Day 2, Session 2, October 20th, 2020. This session was with Dr. Stephanie Nixon talking about the DEPICT model. Please note that the first couple of minutes of the session were not recorded.
Rely on those partners to be able to find and access and convince others to participate in the study. Sometimes they're involved in collecting the data, but we found that rarely are those folks involved in actually analyzing the data. It's almost like analysis, data analysis is set up as some fancy rarefied thing that only people with a PhD can do. And we were really interested in debunking that idea. And so I bring it to you. And this is a question for you to mull over, and you can put up your hand if you have an answer you'd like to share. And Lynn, I'll welcome you to help me with this. And the question is, why might we want to engage in collaborative analysis anyways, and especially collaborative analysis with people who are usually excluded from research, people from communities that are usually pushed to the margins? Why might we even want to do that? Over to you if you have thoughts about why that actually is of value to research, why we might want to be more collaborative in our analysis versus leaving it to the PhD scientist in the ivory tower.
Vitalis, please go ahead.
Okay, so well, in order to be able to give the results of the research good quality, we want to engage everybody in the research or in the analysis.
Thank you. Vero, please go ahead.
When when you engage in a collaborative analysis, is to be able to identify specific needs, maybe by gender, disability specific needs, that will be very detailed.
Thank you, Vero. Did you get those, Stephanie?
Yes, thank you. Very helpful.
And there's one more, I think. Leslie, go ahead.
I was also thinking how during qualitative analysis, for example, we often try to come up with things and make connections between ideas, and someone who is like a member might be able to do certain things like the PhD researchers might not be able to because of their own experience.
I had a bit of trouble hearing Leslie, but Stephanie, did you get that?
I feel like I got enough. Yeah.
Okay. 9, please go ahead.
Okay, I think that we may want to engage collaborative analysis to prevent the risks of bias, such that our studies will not be limited to what we think, but it will be based on so many other people's objectives. That way our results can be of good quality. Thank you.
Thank you. And Clementine, please go ahead. Clementine, did you have a comment? Okay.
Yes, Lynn, I think engaging in collaborative analysis ensures that we derive like, oh my God.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
You, Clementine. I'm sorry.
Give the right interpretation to the analysis that we of the data that we get from the research field.
Thank you. Okay, back to you, Stephanie. Lots of good responses there.
Yes, so helpful. And a number of themes came up, but one in particular I just want to amplify, echo and amplify, is the value of having multiple perspectives at the table, multiple forms of expertise in order to more robustly, more comprehensively understand or make sense of the data that we're getting. And so if those are some of the reasons why we might want to engage in collaborative analysis, we also need to pay attention to rigor and why it matters. And this is regardless of quantitative or qualitative. Any inquiry in research needs to pay attention to rigor. And when we talk about rigor, what we're talking about is how trustworthy the results are, how trustworthy the results are. And there's different ways to ensure and promote rigor, depending on whether your research is quantitative or qualitative. There are different ways of understanding how to make your research rigorous, depending on those two very different approaches. And I want to set this up a little bit for us to help explain why the collaborative analysis process called DEPICT, the one that Sarah Flicker and I developed, why we set it up the way we did. Because what we're going for there is that it's inclusive, so it's collaborative and welcomes people who might not have PhDs and offices in universities, and it's also rigorous. And so what I'm showing you now is a picture of two triangles side by side. And the one on the left I'm going to use to explain quantitative, the logic behind quantitative research. And on the right, the logic behind qualitative research. And there's a lot of arrows and things happening in these images if you can see them. What's most important, I'm going to explain to you. And we're going to start with the triangle on the left. This is a triangle where the flat base is along the bottom and it goes up to a point at the top. I've just put a green circle around the point at the top. And in quantitative research, just like the black arrows on the inside of this triangle show us, it starts with the broad base at the bottom of theory and knowledge and thinking and ideas. And it comes up with a question that has a single point of an answer, a single one truth that we are trying to get at. A yes or a no, or how many? 27. Or which is better? That one, right? These are questions that have very specific single answers. It presumes that what we are seeking is a single objective truth. And so all kinds of forms of strategies are used to be rigorous, to make sure that the results are trustworthy, that we can believe or trust that this is the one right answer. Now over to the triangle on the right, it is a very different story when it comes to qualitative research. And in this triangle, we're going to start with the point at the bottom, and that's where we begin, is with a very specific instance or experience that we want to understand. And by exploring it, and again, I'm going to ask you to follow the black arrows inside, not the big white arrows outside, the black arrows inside this triangle. We start with a specific instance at the bottom, and we go through a process of inquiry that opens up, that leads to a big, comprehensive, robust understanding of a phenomenon. We're no longer looking for one right answer. You know, if you were to ask folks about what's their experience as a person with certain impairments of trying to get around their city, there won't be a single right answer, you know, if that's 28, right? It won't be a single right answer. And if one person with some impairments says, this is my experience, and someone else with the same impairment says, and this is my experience, and they aren't the same experience. Does that mean one of them is wrong? No, of course not. They're both right. It's their experience. It is their own truth. And so what we're doing in qualitative is we're starting at a very specific phenomenon, and we are trying to come to open it up, try to understand its complexity, and not search for a single truth, but rather a coherent sense-making of these various messages and stories and narratives that we hear in this research. Okay. If you 100% understood what I just explained there, then that would be extraordinary. What I'm hoping is that you at least half got it. If you feel like, okay, I sort of somewhat understood what she said, or I mostly, then that is enough for us to go on. I wanted to give you that base to allow us to focus in now on why might we do this collaborative qualitative analysis the way we are for it to be rigorous. So here we go. So on to questions 3 and 4, which we'll do in combination. What might be a rigorous way to collaboratively conduct a qualitative analysis? This was the question Sarah and I were grappling with. And then why might it be relevant for PIRL? We're going to get your wheels turning on that during this part. And then in the next part after the break, that's where you're going to do this in more depth. And so here's the description straight from the PIRL, the conference proceedings. It said, doing data analysis as a team is crucial for inclusive research. During part 1 of this 2-part session, Stephanie will provide a session on the DEPICT model as an evidence-based approach to group data analysis. And I'm showing you a picture of the first page of the article in which we described this method. And you can see here that we describe it as a model for participatory qualitative health promotion research analysis based on work that the two of us had done. We're both Canadians, but work that we had done in Canada, Zambia, and South Africa with various partners. And I'm showing you a lot of words on the screen right now. And these are straight from the article. It's from the abstract. And I wanted to give you a sense straight from the article of what was the whole thing about. And then after this, we'll go into the 6 steps of DEPICT. So it's a reminder that we said health promotion researchers, so everyone doing research related to health promotion or health in general, are increasingly conducting what we called community-based participatory research in an effort to reduce health disparities. So this was written broadly to folks concerned with inequities, not just disability inclusive development, but it certainly applies. We then pointed out that despite efforts toward greater inclusion, research teams regularly exclude diverse representation, right? They regularly exclude community-based folks from data analysis in particular. And so we developed the DEPICT model to do this, and in a way that actually improves the rigor. It's broken down into 6 sequential steps. So it's a sequence of 6 steps, and you'll see DEPICT, the word has 6 letters. So we crammed our 6 steps into an acronym, DEPICT. We also flagged that it's not actually that easy to take on. You can't just pick it up out of the blue. It actually needs some good leadership. It needs people with coordination skills, like group coordination skills. And it takes people with facilitation skills as well to make it work, right? Like most activities that are collaborative. However, the process is also flexible and can be used in lots of different spaces with all kinds of degrees of different levels of expertise. And at the end of the day, the whole point is the point you were helping us see earlier, which is that including diverse stakeholders on an analysis team, it makes things better by providing a more nuanced understanding of complicated health problems. It makes research better, more rigorous. So DEPICT is 6 steps. And I want to remind everybody that, remember earlier I was saying, when you're going through a process of research, you start with designing the study and then recruiting participants, collecting data, etc. What we're talking about here is exclusively the analysis. So the steps here start once your data are collected. So when you have your data, you have a whole bunch of raw data. It might be transcripts from interviews or focus groups. It might be a whole bunch of pages of the answers that people gave to open-ended questions in your survey. But here we are starting this process with the data being collected, and we're asking, now what? What do we do with all these data to try to make sense of them? And so step 1 starts with those data. By the time we get to the 6th step, we are translating our results to the public that needs to know about them. So that is the part of the research process we are zeroing in on. It is exclusively analysis. And so the first step is probably going to be no surprise. It's called dynamic reading, the D of DEPICT, dynamic reading. And this is where each of the team members, and I'm imagining here a team, and I invite you to kind of picture this for yourself. Who might your team be? What might a team look like? And so this could be your the principal investigators, but also the other team members who might have been part of designing the study. Along the way, you might have gathered some students who are helping out. And hopefully there are some community members that are interested in this study as well, that you're inviting in, welcoming into this team. There might be a clinician or two, someone who, an NGO worker perhaps, someone who's a policymaker. So it could be just about anybody, right? A big diverse team of folks who you have thought, you know, this study would be better if we had their expertise at the table to help us make sense of these data. So here we are at the first step, where each team member, so everybody, pores over some of the data. And often in qualitative research, there is so much data, it's actually quite overwhelming and daunting. And so part of the beauty of this approach is that you can share the work. And so someone who's coordinating the process would assign transcripts or pieces of the data to different team members. And what you do is you ask your team members to read over and get really familiar with these data, these transcripts, these interviews, these survey answers that were open-ended. And as they're doing it, you ask them to stay connected to the original research questions. Often we'll like write out those research questions on a card and pin them on our bulletin board or something like that. So that we're always reminded, what questions are we trying to answer at the end of the day? And this is the time to really affirm for people that the perspective they have is the perspective you need. That it's they're at the table because they bring something special. And it's not that there's some fancy academic expertise they need to make sense of these data. It's the perspective they've got. Now, as folks go, they may want to make notes in the margins of these. So it might be that they're reading them on paper and they're actually jotting little notes for themselves on the side, or it might be that this is a Word document and people are putting little comments in. And I haven't done this, but Sarah has, where she's used this method with street youth who don't have great literacy skills. And so to make that possible, they got into pairs or trios and would have someone who is a better reader read the data aloud to the others. Or you could just give them the original recording of the interview, so that just because someone can't read doesn't mean that they can't participate in this process. So does this have to happen, this first step, all together? It doesn't. It can be that you pull your team together, or it could be that you make a decision as a team that it's going to be dispersed and that everyone's got their work to do and we're going to go away and do it over the next couple of weeks, and then we're going to come back together for the next step. Or it might be we're going to spend a day together. We actually are all going to come together and make a beautiful day of it, and we're going to do this work while we're spending the day. So there's a number of ways to tackle this first step. And so that's the beginning. So I want you to take a moment and just jot down for yourself, how could you imagine this even looking with your team? What might this look like within your team? And it's possible you're on multiple teams. So go ahead and kind of imagine different groups. Is there a beautiful space somewhere that everyone can get to where that's where you meet up and decide to spend the afternoon doing this work? Is it that your group is really digitally savvy and it's fine to organize all of this by email and give people their assignments and send them the info they need to review? Is it a mix of both? And there's some folks where this needs to be on paper that's printed out and delivered to them or some other format. So just take a quiet moment to jot down for yourself. If you were to gather a beautiful, big, diverse team and wanted to have them pour over some of the data, how would you practically do that? So go ahead, take a moment, jot that down for yourself. Once everyone has had a chance to familiarize themselves with some of the data, it's time to develop a code book. And some people call a code book a coding framework or a coding structure. I'm using those terms interchangeably. For me, they're the same thing right now. Code book, coding framework, coding structure, coding categories. They all mean the same thing. And that is that it's a list of the categories and possibly subcategories that your team collectively is going to use to organize the raw data. And by organize, I mean you're going to look through those transcripts once we've decided on these categories and decide which sections of those transcripts actually belong in which category. And that is what's often called coding. So you might look at a transcript and it's 5 pages long. And that transcript, and it's from an interview. And so it's the written out part of the interview. And it's 5 pages long. And you're going to imagine there's line numbers on all the pages. So from 1 to 1000 by the last line. And as you're reading through, what you're paying attention to is, oh, in this stretch here, like the whole first half of the first page, they are talking about X. That belongs in the category that's about X. Okay, so that's the coding we're talking about. And so what we're doing at this stage is we are creating the categories that we will use for coding. Now, these categories, there's a couple of ways to decide what they should be. And some folks talk about that in terms of deductive and inductive. So deductive are the kinds of categories that you could pick even before you conducted the first interview. You haven't even collected any data yet, and yet you already know one or more of the categories or topics that you want to collect code data into because they're right in your research questions. You already know you're asking about X, Y, and Z. That is your research question. And so you've decided in advance that in your coding framework or your code book, one of the categories is going to be X, one's going to be Y, and one's going to be Z. So that's the types of categories you know before you even collect the first bit of data. However, the beauty of qualitative research, the strength of qualitative research, is that we are starting with a phenomenon. Remember the bottom of the pyramid, the bottom of the triangle, and we are opening it up. We are making new things thinkable, new things imaginable. If you do your qualitative inquiry well, hopefully what happens is some ideas come to light that you didn't see coming, that you didn't anticipate. You are making possible new ways of thinking about things, thanks to the great in-depth conversations with your participants. And so the second way that you can identify categories for the code book is by poring over those data and saying, what are some of these topics or recurring messages that we're seeing here that seem to be really important across the data? And let's have categories for them. And one way, and it's not that you need to do one or the other, often both are in a code book. And a process that Sarah and I used in pre-COVID days when it was easy to come together in person is that we would ask people who, during phase one, during their poring over of the data, the dynamic reading, to collect phrases or ideas on little sticky notes. And we would come together around a big table and everyone would explain their different sticky notes and put them at different places on the table. And as others brought theirs as well, we would start to group together. We would group like with like until by the end, we have big clusters and we would give those clusters a name. And those would be our categories, inductively derived from the dynamic reading. You can do this through conversation, right, on Zoom, and I'm sure that there are online techniques or ways visually to do this as well. I haven't done it yet, but I'm sure it's possible. And so what you get to in this phase is a draft code book, and you try it out first. You try coding and you refine it. And what you're trying to do is land on a set of categories that are stable, meaning that everyone in your team has a shared understanding of what those categories are. So this is a really big step. And here I'm going to give you two examples of what this has looked like in projects of mine. So what might the code book actually look like? And just before I go, let me warn you, these images are really hard to see. So if they seem blurry to you, I don't want you to worry about that. I'm going to explain what's important about them. So the first one, what I'm showing you is part of, whoops. I'm showing you part of a coding worksheet. And so the way that we did it in this project is we developed on a Word document a worksheet, and it was a table. And the table had 3 categories, and the table is the code book. So the first category was called name of category. The second is the description of that category. And the third is the line numbers. So you would use one of these worksheets for each transcript. And so that's where you'd put the line numbers from the transcript that fit into a category. And up in the top, we have transcript number and the coder's name. So to be able to keep track of what transcript is even being coded here and who did it. And there's a little trick that I do in all of my code books. I have the same final 2 codes every time, and I'm showing them here. They're listed here as 5 and 6. 5 seems important, but there's no code for it. So this is, and then under the description of the category, it helps us understand what this category is about. So it includes any content that seems relevant for the research question, but does not fit above. And then 6 we call gems. And so as people are paying close attention to the raw data, this is inviting them to note any specific quotes that seem really striking or special that might even end up being the title of a manuscript one day. So what you can imagine is that on the next slide, I'm about to show you 1 to 4, right? I've got this first column is called name of category, and I showed you 5 and 6 because they're generic. They're the last 2 of every code book I create. But what were 1 to 4, and what might that look like? Well, in this study, this was a study of how we might think about the better recruitment and retention of Indigenous students into physio programs in Canada. And categories 1 to 4, all of these were derived inductively. Derived inductively, by which I mean these weren't the research questions per se. These seem to be the main messages or the main themes, I guess, that came up in the data. And we found them by looking at the data in step 1 and deciding, yeah, these are the categories or buckets by which we want to organize our data. So one was called structural challenges. The second one, getting into PT programs related to the admissions process. Third, exposure and outreach to increase awareness of PT. And then fourth was strategies PT schools could try. And really important was our description in the second column, so that when folks go away and do coding on their own, we all have a shared understanding. Now this is so there were only 6 categories here, right? And only 4 of them, in fact, were related to the data. I'm going to show you now another coding framework. And this is hard to read the specific words, but there's 2 points I want to make with this. The first is to show you that 11 and 12, they're the same 2 that I finish with every time. Seems important, but not captured above. And GEMS, so it's the same last 2, but now they're 2 of 12. So this was a different approach. We had many, many more categories that the group thought were relevant. And not only that, we have subcategories. So we had not just 1, 2, 3 down to 12, but sometimes the categories were felt so big to us that we wanted to subdivide. So we have a 3A, a 3B, a 3C that are subcategories within 3. And so just to say that that is welcome and allowed as well. And moving right into this, hopefully is going to make lots of sense to you, moving into the actual coding. Once you've got your code book set up, then step 3 is the participatory coding. And here's where it's divided out. And that's another great reason to have a big team, right? Because there's a lot of work to do here. And so our usual approach is to say we want each transcript, meaning each interview or focus group or each set of data, to be coded by 2 different team members, and not together. They're off doing this work on their own, unless there is a reason why it makes good sense to do it together. For instance, if it's related to accessibility or literacy. And there's lots of ways to actually code. We've been tending to do it using computers, using that Word document, and there's different types of software packages out there. One that we've used is called In Vivo, that will help to organize the data. But you don't have to. It can be low tech. It can be printed out on paper and cut up into different sections that then get relocated into the coding piles. And this can be done apart, or it can be done together, but it's work that takes a little bit of time. And what you will end up with at the end of this, so here I am showing a picture of the coding framework that had those 6 categories in it. Once we've had every transcript coded, what we'll end up with for this study is 6 piles, if you've done it in old-fashioned cutting, or files, digital files, where you have 1 that is for each category. So for instance, number 1, structural considerations or challenges, it will be either a pile of paper or a Word file. And what will be in that pile or that file is all of the stretches of data, all the sections of the stories that our participants told us that the different team members thought belong in this category of structural considerations. And so it's the pieces of each of the transcripts that fit in each of the categories. So at the end of this step, you'll have 1 collection of data from across all the transcripts for each of the coding categories. And so the question for you, and I want you to think about this, and I'm going to invite you to speak your answers, is if that's where you were at in the process, then what might come next? What would it make sense for your team to do next once the data are organized into these categories or buckets? For instance, if you were the team that was working on that question about better recruiting more Indigenous students into physio programs, and you talked to, I think we talked to a dozen different experts on this. We took all their transcripts and we coded them into those 6 categories. And what we have now are a file, a big Word document that includes the messages from every single person we talked about that has to do with category 1. And then we have a separate one with category 2, all the way down to category 6. Those 6 files. What would it make sense to do next for this collaborative process? Over to you to tell me what you think.
Stephanie, it's Lynn. I'm actually going to ask you to continue on with the next steps because we only have 5 minutes left before we need to take our break.
Okay.
Or that you finish. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. That's great advice. We'll change it from a conversation into a, in your own mind, what do you think you might do next?
Thank you.
And tell me if this is it. Tell me if it's step 4, inclusive reviewing and summarizing of the categories. In other words, you would look really carefully at each of those piles or files or buckets and say, what are we learning? And so this first bullet point is from straight from the paper. I thought, let me just bring this quote right to you, where Sarah and I said, what we tend to do is put people into pairs or dyads and ask the dyads to look for convergent and divergent viewpoints. Remember, we're not looking for a single truth. And we are asking them also to note where there are surprising silences and to have a look for some emblematic quotes. And what we ask folks to do, because usually it's a ton of data, it can be very overwhelming. And so what we ask folks to do is in their pairs to develop a summary that makes it easier for everyone else. So for each category, we then have a 2-page summary. And we often give folks these instructions for developing their summary. We say let's have a template so all the summaries look the same. Let's have the codebook category and who are the team members that created it. And let's have everybody answer these same questions. First, what are the common themes or messages that you're seeing across all the data in this category? And we ask folks to give the theme a name and then describe it. And so I put a few bullets here, but it could be as many as folks see. And we also ask, what's a surprise, right? Where might there be actual contradictions, where there's competing views of something, or something that's missing, something you're surprised isn't there. And so that's the framework for these summaries. And so again, for in your own mind, once you have 2-page summaries, or 1 or 3, right? It's doesn't need to be 2 exactly. Once you have the data distilled into these summaries for each category, what makes sense to do next? And hopefully what you're thinking is what we thought. It's step 5. We call it collaborative analyzing. This is, some of the other steps you don't need to do together. This one you absolutely need to do together. It doesn't need to be physically together, but it's about bringing the perspectives and minds together. And it could start with creating a descriptive report based just on the summaries, but then it's looking at those descriptive summaries, going back to the original research questions and asking, what did we learn? And often what we try to do is to visualize how all of these messages and themes fit together visually, graphically, schematically. And as you can imagine, this is where skilled facilitation is really, really helpful. And I'll show you a couple of examples of where graphics have gotten to. Because remember, this is not the triangle where we're going to a single objective truth, yes or no, 28, more, or yes, this intervention works. This is about taking a specific phenomenon and developing a robust, complex understanding of it. So I'm going to show you 2 pictures. The first picture I'm showing you is from a study where we were talking with colleagues, rehab colleagues in Kenya and Zambia about the role of rehabilitation for people living with HIV and their experience of being involved in helping to teach that. And as we looked through all the transcript, we realized there actually was a central theme, and it was about missed opportunities. And the research question wasn't, what are the missed opportunities? That was what came out in the data. And we found that there were 6 ways that these missed opportunities played out. And so we set them up as rays of the sun like that. And this one, don't worry about the reading. It's just to show you, again, a more sophisticated example of how some ideas fit together and how they contributed elsewhere and what informed them. And we close with translating. Once you've made sense of your qualitative data, you say, who are the audiences that need to know this, and how might we get the message out to them? Almost always we're required to, by our funder and others, to try to publish in peer-reviewed journals. But there's also all kinds of other ways to get this information out, depending on who you're trying to reach. And this, again, is where having a diverse team makes so much sense, right? And so those are the 6 steps. And at the end of the day, this is the final slide. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is say, how can we have a qualitative analysis that is the best of inclusion with the best of rigor? And that's the story of the DEPICT model. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We have promised participants that we're going to keep to time so that people could, you know, plan their sessions and their breaks and all of that. And so we do need to end up now, but we will say a couple of things just as we end. So very big thank you to Stephanie. Stephanie, I think you might be able to stay on for another 10 minutes just in case there's some informal discussion. That be okay?
Yes, absolutely. I look forward to that.
Great. And for all of the rest of us, so feel free to stick around, but do take a break, stretch your legs, move around, whatever you need to do. We will come back as a large group, and then we will very quickly go into breakout rooms. I think I figured out how to do the breakout rooms. So we will go into breakout rooms, and you will have an opportunity to focus in on one of those steps. So that's what we're going to do for the next hour. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Stephanie. So if anyone has a more informal question that you'd like to ask Stephanie, please feel free to turn on your mic. You can step away if you'd like, whatever. Go ahead.
Thank you, please, Mbibe. Thank you, Stephanie, for this great presentation. I listened with a lot of enthusiasm. Quite remember, I've read some of your works, and especially when I got in contact with ICDR, and this DEPICT model is is my best of all the different. So you've made us to understand today. I love the presentation, very down to earth, and it shows us how involved you can be with the community. My question is, how do you sustain the interest in community members to take part in this kind of activity, let me call it so, that people think it's for the experts? And we can have the will to bring in community participants into this process. And most of the research teams I've worked with, even with researchers, they are like, no, please, let's keep them away from this analysis stuff. They will disturb us, they will make us to waste more time. I don't have energy, let us sit together. And so how do you even, so you have that conflict between you, the experts, who want to do your things fast and go away, and then the community participants who don't have that interest even in the analysis. So how do you bridge this gap?
This is a wonderful question. I bet there's many on the line who also would have ideas for this. I'll tell you what we've done in our own work. A couple of approaches. so much of participatory research is based in relation, isn't it? It's based in relationships and trust building. And the deeper we can get in our trust with our non-academic partners, with our partners that are in the community, the better we can engage with them on why any of this research might matter for them anyway. The more we can have folks involved in designing studies that they're excited about, you know, or maybe even if they weren't involved in designing the study and deciding what the question should be in the first place, there may be something that they're a capacity they'd like to be building in their own world that participation in this study gives them the chance to do. The chance to become better at X, Y, or Z, something that you know, you come to realize through the relationship with them. And I guess the other piece would be, we don't tend to approach treating all of the team members the exact same way. It's not like if we have 8 team members, all 8 need to do the exact same thing. Especially our community members, we try to meet them where they're at. And if they don't have the ability to take on a huge amount of work, can they take on a small or medium amount? And which pieces are appealing and energizing to them? So those are some of the ways that we might think about it.
Okay, thank you so much, Steph.
Stephanie, thanks for responding to that question from Alvin as well. Yeah, it's sort of outside the main topic. What influence do funders or sponsors have? But it would be a really interesting discussion to have as well.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what, Lynn, another point that's come up in this DEPICT work that I'll just name in case it comes up for your group as well, is I've been trying to use DEPICT in a study with some Indigenous partners. And what we realized is that from the worldview of these particular Indigenous folks, it is not appropriate to take stories apart, to compartmentalize stories, and that rather stories are sacred and need to be held together as wholes. And so the idea of coding is hugely problematic within that framing. And so we did some modifying to the DEPICT model to make it less about coding, taking apart the stories, but still trying to do the broader theme-based work in a collaborative way. So just naming that that's a very Western thing to do, to take apart stories, and that if it doesn't feel right for everybody in the research they're doing, depending on where they're coming from, that follow those instincts.
Yeah, so maybe, you know, really the first step is, what are we trying to do, which is what you emphasized, right? What are we really trying to do together, and why? So thank you.
Yeah.
We are also going to be asking people to think about financial compensation and other resources that are provided. I know that that's a short statement in the article, but a long discussion that people need to have.
And you know what should have been part of my response to Louis as well is that we compensate people where we can and where and in ways that feel appropriate. But yeah, that makes it far more possible, of course, for community folks to be engaged.
Yeah. So thank you once again. I'm going to call everybody back. So welcome back.